so this might well be the main reason why I ended up handling John's collection, when, as we've already heard, they were looking at other places as well. We were sitting in his son's living room, drinking coffee, eating biscuits, chatting about things, going through a box full of bits and pieces, and these recordings came out. All of his notes came out, other bits and pieces came out, and this was in the bottom of the box. And this is the sign that was on the Reid and Segrist offices. It's obviously post 1954 because they're at that time they were part of the Decca Company, which is where the Bell and Howell collection comes in. And as they brought this out of the box, I could hardly contain myself. I said, "But this is the sign off the wall. This is what they." And it had been obviously made into a desk type. It'd been mounted in this wood. It got green baize on the back to stop it scratching the table. And I think they could see my enthusiasm for the collection just by my reaction to this, which is as close a connection you can get to actually apart from actually being in the factory. So that was on the wall towards the end of their existence. Okay, so this is another really weird part of of John's collection. This is a Reid camera cradle. I've put here it's based on a Cooke Perkins model. I think probably more blatant copy of covers it because there's hardly any differences between it apart from the way the camera actually mounts on the on this cradle thing. As you can see on the Cooke Perkins one down in the bottom right, there's a mount there, so that screws into the tripod mount on your camera. But obviously you can't do that on a Reid because the tripod mount is way off to one side. So what they've done is they've redesigned that top mount, as you can see there on the other pictures, with the camera mounting screw right on the far end, and then two posts at the opposite end, which have got like little plastic covers on them to stop it from scratching the camera. So basically, you just push the camera into that in between those two posts, and then hopefully your tripod mount lines up at the other end, and you can nice and sturdily hold your camera. And there it is, top left in all its glory. Only ever seen one more of these, and only ever seen the original Cooke Perkins version once online. So really, really unusual. I mean, it's possible this was never a production item. It might be they just made it as a prototype, and then it was decided that they couldn't. It was too involved. One of the things that I think is fairly obvious to anybody who's ever handled a Reid or even seen any of these accessories and bits and pieces from John's collection is, if anything, they were sort of over-engineered. They were absolutely fanatical in the finish. All the chromed parts were hand polished before they were plated. Everything was, and because they were obviously precision engineers making stuff for aircraft, which could well mean that people's lives were depending on them, they really went over and above on the quality of their engineering. And it may be, as with things like the lens hood, that there was just so much work involved in them that they knew it was never going to make any money. As it happened, there was too much work involved in making the camera, and they never made any money anyway. And from what we've learned from the various interviews with people who worked at the factory, there didn't seem to be a huge amount of enthusiasm within the workforce to produce cameras. They were all talented engineers and used to producing high quality work, but they didn't really have the enthusiasm to say, "God, I've made a camera," or "We've made these parts of the camera," and that, along with their abysmal marketing, I think was part of their downfall. Okay, we mentioned earlier enlargers. So Reid and Segrist made what was it's ostensibly an improved copy of the Lights Vallejo enlarger. Not easy to find and almost impossible to find these leaflets that go with it. They improved it actually in quite a number of ways. As you can see, they've got a push button system for sliding the column up and down sliding the head up and down on the column, which is spring loaded and very positive. And they'd neatly run all the cabling underneath the baseboard, which was raised up slightly off the desk. And what you might just about be able to see in that bottom left-hand corner is, in the bottom left-hand picture of that corner of that picture, is the on-off switch. So you could control switching the enlarger on and off from the baseboard, which is particularly useful as opposed to when you're doing a big enlargement, having it right at the top of the column and having to reach up to find the on-off switch, which may possibly induce some vibration into it. And then right at the top there is the little plaque, which I said is similar to the one that was on their box of lenses, which was on the front of the enlarger. So this is 35mm only enlarger, and it must have been relatively early on in their production, because as you can see, it's got the R&S logo, which was the one that they'd originally introduced onto the camera, which was then changed to the script. Now, they weren't averse to just sticking with 35mm. So this is a prototype glassless negative carrier for that enlarger. As you can see there from John's notes, it's come from PS. That's one of the guys that he actually interviewed and went to see on a couple of occasions, and it's come from his box of bits. I'm guessing that that all these guys, when the factory finally closed down or the camera production ceased, and they got rid of all the odds and ends, there were still bits that individuals had got left over in their drawers and, you know, work in progress or something, and they just stuck it all in a bag and took it home. So this was from PS's box of bits, and as you can see, it's a sliding negative carrier, which is sort of click stop, for want of a better description, at 127 and at 35mm half frame increments. So this would have covered all of the what they called miniature formats back then, with one enlarger. Obviously, what it wouldn't have covered was medium format. So this is the only known example of the 6x6 large format enlarger, which was never went into production. As you can see, it does have several similar parts to the 35mm version. The column's longer. It's got the same push button system for going up and down on the column. It has a negative carrier, a negative carrier with glass, because anybody who's ever tried to print 6x6 or larger negatives will know that unless it's perfectly flat, it can be a nuisance. And then using glass also introduces the possibility of Newton's rings, which can be even more of a nuisance. So they were fiddling around with this. It's got those rabbit ear things at the top there were the method for removing the negative carrier and locking it into place. And it would revolve, but I think there was just so much work involved that I guess they assumed that the market was just not big enough to go through. So that's the only time you're ever going to see a 6x6 Reid and Segrest enlarger. Down the bottom left are some of the accessories that most of us have seen. They must be the most common of the Reid accessories, which is a set of interchangeable interlocking extension tubes. So you can put these in between your camera body and your lens, which allows you to focus much closer than it would do normally. Always a bit tricky with a rangefinder camera, although two of the people who John interviewed did mention that at some stage there was talk about them introducing a mirror box, So sort of like the equivalent of the Leica Visiflex, I guess, or the Canon mirror box, so that you could achieve SLR viewing with your rangefinder camera. But again, I think it was probably going to be too little too late. As you can see, I think on the top left-hand picture, that's a production item, and underneath it is the test item, which they kept as a reference to, in the factory, so that all the others were measured against that one. On the right-hand side is what they called their close focus attachment, very similar to the Leica version. Again, it's got that lovely R&S interlocking logo, which I really like. And again, this was used pretty much in the way that you would use the Leica one in conjunction with the enlarger. So here it is in use. So you do actually get SLR viewing with that, but again, it's an incredibly rare. I'm not sure it ever went into full production. So it's really difficult to find this, although this is the actual box that it came in, and I can't think, it's possible that it was designed for something else, but I can't think of any other Reid and Segrist item which would fit in a box like that, whereas that close copy attachment does fit pretty much exactly in that box. So maybe it did go into limited production and they just decided that the numbers just didn't add up, so it wasn't worth their while carrying on. Okay, during the break, we briefly mentioned spare parts. There was a crazy amount of spare parts, and obviously John had, these red boxes are the boxes as they came out of the factory, and John has very diligently marked everything up with what they were. There were other boxes of spares which were not specifically for Reid. There was a couple of odds and ends which were Leica spare parts, but the vast majority of them were, I guess, the sort of things that the parts department had on their shelves, or when they went into production. These were the things that's, the picking list said you want one winder assembly with a knob, one rangefinder prism, and all the parts that were listed to actually produce that camera. So there was thousands and thousands of these parts. Here's a few more of them, all multiples of everything. I sort of had a gut feeling that these might cause some interest, but I took advice from a camera repair guy that I knew, who came and had a good look at everything. And as maybe Jen will fill us in a bit later on, he thought that probably there wasn't all that much value in them. And he said, yeah, you could use one or two of the parts, but maybe that amount of them, there's not going to be enough. Oh, sorry, I'll go back. We ended up selling them as that was one lot as it is. The previous picture was another lot of spares. There's some more that we'll come to in a minute. Everything made crazy money. It was just amazing. Okay, so this came in with the spare parts as well, which is, as we saw from the previous picture, there was some Reid shutter and winder parts, and what turned out to be an experimental film winder with an integral frame counter, which was going to be on the X4. In fact, it was on the X4, and this was maybe going to be introduced into all their other cameras. It's really almost unheard of to find this sort of thing from a reasonably well-known camera company. Anything Leica that comes onto the market that's been used in the factory always fetches crazy money, and these didn't disappoint either. This is one of the other items that I managed to buy for myself because I thought it was just so historically interesting. So these are the various stages of how they designed and were going to produce the in-winder film counter. There's a couple of different versions of it even. So you can follow the logic of their thinking. As you can see in down the bottom left, one has got black letters on a white background. The other one's got white letters on a black background. So these are in various stages of assembly right up to the completed items. And that little funny thing on the right is the insertion tool that they used in the factory to insert and to remove these things as they were going along. As you can see, that tool is a relatively crude, for want of a better description, thing, but it was exactly that. It was a tool. They just needed something that they could line up with the holes in whatever it was they wanted to remove. Somebody would have knocked that up in the factory probably within half an hour, and then it was often being used. This is some of the other work in progress items which came out of the spares department. As you can see, some of them have already got serial numbers engraved in them. They're obviously in various stages of work. I have included those serial numbers on my list of numbers, which is on the web, which I can give anybody interested the address for later. So I have included those in the list of serial numbers, but I have flagged them up as being, body chassis only, or work in progress from John's collection. So it's not a complete camera. So if at a later date that P1014 actually came onto the market as a finished camera, then we would all know that it was made up from bits. There's a few more work in progress parts. So these are a cross section of base plates and top plates and some other bits and pieces, some of which, if they have already been engraved with the numbers again, and a couple of which are actually stamped as masters. So those were like that's what all the work in progress had to measure up against. If it was exactly the same as the master, then it was passed. If it varied in any way, then it was obviously sent back for any rework until they were sure that everything that went out of the factory was exactly the same. Again, testament to the quality of their engineering, or over engineering, as I've been tending to call it. There's a couple of my favourite parts here. So this is the factory tooling that was used for forming and then engraving the top plates. They obviously had their own engraving machines, which, if you've ever seen one, if you look up the history of Taylor Hobson, or you look at any of their work, the machine that's used for engraving is like the size of a filing cabinet. It's a massive, great thing. So obviously they were down the bottom left-hand corner there. You can see that's the fixture where they put in their blank. Presumably it was pressed over that to give it the shape, with that tool that's at the top, and then it was engraved on the engraving machine. And as you can see, some of these are blank, some of them are part done, and up in the top right-hand corner there is the wooden former that they used before they produced the tool. So there's the whole story of of just the top plate there. Here's another bit of that story. This is what I think must have been a practice top plate by somebody who was working out, how to use the engraving machine. It's got the Reid engraved logo and a serial number, which again I've recorded. But it's also got some some sort of scribbles, so it just looks like it's somebody practicing on how to use that machine. And interestingly, or not as the case may be, typical British factory workers' humour, they seem to have changed the name from Reid and Siegrist to Reid and Siegpist, which I think is probably somebody internally just having a bit of a laugh. So here's some more of the tools they actually used in the factory. So there's the range finder coupling gauge there, which was used to fine tune the lenses. I'm guessing that the bit in the bottom right was actually affixed to the workbench so that whatever they were testing didn't move, because it's got those sort of holes on the bottom, and you screwed your lens into it. Interestingly, the gauge is actually a Reid and Segrist product. If you look, you can see at the top it says Reid and Segrist Limited, focus mount microscope and rangefinder lens coupling. I've never seen another one of those anywhere or even heard of one. So whether it was only sold into other engineering or optical factories for use, or it was used for part of their military contracts for for fine tuning bomb sites or military rangefinders or something like that, because it doesn't actually say camera lens on it. It says rangefinder lens, so easy to just assume it's for the rangefinder camera, but they probably were in production of other rangefinders as well as ones that were built into the cameras. So almost unique item, I think. Okay, so here we come to my favourite part of the talk. So I have a question for Leica owners. First of all, can you spot the fake Leica? Probably not all that easy to do if you're just looking at it on screen. So obviously these pictures have come from different places, but say maybe difficult to see on your computer, but I'm wondering if you can spot the fake. I'll leave it there for a couple more seconds. I'm sure you've all had a good look at these in your minds. Okay, actually they're all fakes. None of those is an actual proper official Leica. That's probably fairly easy for the one on the bottom right, which is one of these horrible things that you can buy on the internet where they've taken a Russian copy and Nazi-fied it or made it into some commemorative model which never actually existed. But none of the others are fake. None of the others are Leicas either. So now we must ask our question. Ask ourselves the question: is your Reid like a Leica, or is your Leica really a Reid? Why am I asking it like that? Okay, so here we have on the right-hand side a proper official Leica made in Germany by Leitz. On the left, we have a fake Leica 3B, which was made in the Reid and Segrist factory by at least one person who was using their never-ending supply of Reid parts to produce Leicas. We think in his lunchtime. Two of the people in John's interviews mentioned that there was a person that was doing this, although neither of them were at that time were happy to actually name who it was. So we think that these were actually unofficially made in the Reid and Segrist factory. They were then at a later date taken just up the road to A.W. Young's in Leicester and sold allegedly as original Leicas in their shop. That's been mentioned by several people. To the uninitiated, and unless you're an absolute Leica enthusiast, I could not work out how John had, unless somebody had given him one and said, oh, this is one I made earlier, how John worked out that they were doing this unofficially, when to all intents and purposes, it looks pretty much like a Leica. So here's a close-up of it. So anybody seeing this quickly flash up onto the screen would think, oh, it's a Leica, it's in quite nice condition, you know, reasonable price, I wouldn't mind have that. Internally, it's probably mostly a Reid. And some of the differences are actually reasonably easy to spot, but only when you've got the two cameras side by side. As you can see, the milling on the wind and the rewind knobs are slightly different. In fact, as you said, I've had to label them when I was doing the photographs. I had to label that camera as the fake, because once I let it go, I wasn't convinced that the one I'd got in my hand was the fake or was the original Leica, because obviously it's made with lots of Leica parts on the outside. Down the bottom, you can see something that's maybe a bit more obvious, which is on the shutter release of the Reid. As you once you've fired the shutter and you wind the film on to recock the shutter, that little cutout in the support for the shutter release has a cutout on it, and you can see it revolving inside, which is really useful so that you know you've loaded the film correctly and it is being wound on, and you're not going to end up with 36 shots all taken on the same frame, which is maybe one reason why they introduced the X5 with the opening back. So some of these differences are quite easy to spot, some not so easy. Some of the spacing on the engraving is slightly different. The base plates are different. One says open and close, and one says open and lock. And the engraving and the little locking thing on the slow speed dial is slightly different. There was in a recent auction, there was another, the only other time that I've seen something actually described as a Leica made in the Reid and Segrist factory in their lunch break. I'm not 100% convinced, because the engraving and the base plate on that particular camera was different to these. It might well be, because it might be that the guy who was making them was using different bits and pieces that happened to come across his bench at the time. But I'll leave that for other people to decide whether it was original or not. Some of the other slight differences is when you put the two cameras side by side, you can see there's a very slight difference in the size of the camera and the way that the strap lugs line up. Also, if you open the back and take off the base, there's a couple of very subtle differences in there. And that sort of, I don't know what you want to call it, that long, thin dogleg plate at the bottom, that's the reason why you can't get the flash sync attachment into a production camera, because it fouls that. The X4 had a slightly different arrangement for that, so that it didn't foul it, but that was something else that was not to happen. The numbering on the outer scale, I think, is pretty similar, but the arrows that point to that number, so you can keep track of how many pictures you've taken, that arrowhead is slightly different to the proper Leica one. The R is a slightly different engraving. So all these things start to be much more obvious, but only when you get the two cameras side by side. So after this meeting, I expect everybody who's got a Leica in their collection to rush off and double check, and then let me know whether they actually have a Leica or they've got a Reid copy. Okay, so we're coming to the end of an era now. Eventually, the factory closed down the production of cameras. They called in a scrap man who did come and take everything away, but luckily he was on the ball and he realised that what he had was worth more as spare parts than as his scrap. And he went to Marston and Hurd, who brought up everything from him, and carried on making as much as they could with all the parts that they had left over. Eventually they ran out of parts, and that all came to a head. But they were selling these finished cameras for A.W. Young, and I presume that they also sold off all the supply of lenses that they had. Over the years, A.W. Young's sold off these lenses, and at the very end of their life, we're now into 1971, obviously camera production's long dead and buried. SLRs are the choice for most people, but they still got a number of Taylor Hobson 2-inch f2 lenses. So they sold them off at the princely sum of £36 each, which even at 1971 prices was quite a reasonable amount of money. But had we have all known, or had we got access to a time machine, we'd all be rushing back there to buy everything they got at £36 a time, because the lenses on their own are anywhere between £1,500 and £2,000 a time now. Interestingly, the reason that we can date this advert absolutely precisely, because it's not shown in the actually the date on the advert or on the magazine or whatever it came from, is that at the bottom it says that you can send us 3 post-dated checks of £12. The last one dated the 3rd of April 1971. So that very nicely dates this this advert to early in 1971, which was quite handy of them. Still a bargain price. So I thought, while we're on the subject of the lenses that you get with a Reid, I'd quickly run through some of the options. I did a talk a while back to a camera club on and at the NEC on using vintage lenses on your modern DSLR. And this is a picture I took with my Micro Four Thirds Olympus with the Taylor Hobson lens attached. It's a bit of a pig to use because the focusing is the depth of field when you're at f2 is not very great. So I picked a subject that really it didn't matter if I didn't get the focusing spot on, something would always be in focus. But I particularly like the way that as it goes out of focus, the artifacts of the lens show up as some really interesting shapes. And this was shot at wide open at f2. Obviously, if it had been closed down, then you'd have got maybe more of the shape of the actual blades that make up the apertures. Okay, this is from John's collection. This is an early example of a Taylor Hobson 2-inch f2 lens, which we think has been assembled using some Nikon lens parts. As you can see there in the top right, it's got the NK designations which Nikon used on their rangefinder copies. And again, if you know your way around a Nikon rangefinder, which I confess I don't, not particularly well, you'll see that some of the engravings on this lens, particularly like the what I guess is the infinitive, the infinity logo down the bottom left, is not the sort of infinity logo that we'd normally expect. And also some of the characters seem to be a slightly different font, excuse me, than we would expect on a production Taylor Hobson lens. So again, this is part of John's fascination with the whole Reid story, encompassing a lot of the Taylor Hobson history as well. So again, I've got a couple of Reids in my collection, and I've checked to see if any of mine have been made using Nikon rangefinder parts, but so far not. So here's a few examples of other lenses that you might find on a Reid camera. These aren't from John's collection, but just to show you what the other things you might come across. On the left is a Cooke Amatol, which has been fitted to a Reid, but wouldn't have been original production. This is the lens that you would more likely to find on the Bell & Howell Photon. And this was one that went through auction recently. And down the bottom is one of the big question marks on the whole of the Taylor Hobson history. So this is what, to all intents and purposes, looks like a conventional Taylor Hobson 2-inch f2 lens, but it's marked National Optical Co. There's very little information about them anywhere. There's an incredibly brief mention of it in some of the history of the Taylor Hobson factory that is lodged at the Leicester University, which I think John saw. And I think John was assuming, the same as the rest of us, that the National Optical Co. was maybe a subdivision of Taylor Hobson, and that it's obviously, it says Co, so maybe it was an incorporated company, but it's possible that maybe they used this, or they were going to use this designation on lenses which were going into countries where maybe Taylor Hobson didn't have the the monopoly on these sort of lenses, or didn't have the following, or for some legal reason weren't allowed to use that name. Very little I can find out about that. Again, if anybody's got any more information about that, would be very interested to know. Okay, so we're now coming on to the ultimate indignity that that Reid has suffered, and this is a camera from my own collection, which is an obvious fake Reid, which has been made again from one of those very popular Soviet Leica copies. I think this is a Fed one, and it's been faked up to make it look like a Reid. The lens cap even, which is obviously nothing like a proper Reid lens cap. The lens, which is obviously a Soviet lens, has been re-engraved with Taylor, which is just a bit strange, and not Taylor Hobson. And the base plate has been engraved as opened and closed instead of open and close, or open and shut, some of them might be. So yeah, so that's so I hope John's not looking down us on this one, because I'm sure he'd be as appalled as I am that this is the way that some people think a Reid should be presented, although it is in my own collection. So that's pretty much it, I think. I have to extend my thanks to the Vincent family for all the help and support that they've given me through this, through the selling of John's collection. They did say that when they were going through John's things after he passed away, that one of the things they found front and centre in his work cabinet was one of my business cards, which ironically at the time was when I wasn't working in the auction world. So it's possible they found me by purposely seeking me out, or if it just happened to be a complete fluke. But all thanks to the Vincent family, and also my thanks to all you for listening to me ramble on for the last hour and 3/4.